You are now listening to the Mental Health Check-In Podcast.
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, and good night to everyone listening at whatever time you're listening. I am Jam, your host for the evening, and really every other evening of the podcast. And this is the Mental Health Check-In Podcast, a podcast dedicated to spreading mental health awareness as a means to help us all heal. I want this podcast to serve as healing for myself, my guests, and of course you listening. So let's all heal together. Today's healing routine sees me sit down with Charlotte T. Martin as my guest. She's a lot of things really. She's an artist, a writer, a screenwriter, a playwright, a public speaking coach, as you'll hear later on, and a podcast host for the show We've Never Met, where she has these intimate, in-depth conversations with strangers who she's talking to for the first time. It's really compelling stuff, and you may also know her from her very self-reflective conversation story and screenwriting blurbs on Instagram. It's amazing stuff, and I recommend you find her on Instagram at Charlotte the Writer if you haven't seen it, and give her a follow while you're at it, especially if you hear her on this podcast and figured you'd like to see more of her. And of course, her podcast, We've Never Met, is available on Apple Podcasts. And if you like this podcast, the Mental Health Check-In Podcast, I'd appreciate if you share this episode. Tweet it, snap it, TikTok it, twist it, bop it, however you decide to share it, because it helps spread the message behind this podcast. And if you spread the message, you spread the healing. And I'm really grateful to know this show has healed a lot of people so fast already. And I'm just as grateful for those willing to share this podcast. Thank you so much. And if this is your first time listening, just know that you can follow us for future updates and episodes at Check-In Pod on Twitter and at Check-In Podcast on Instagram. And you can email us at mentalhealthcheckinpod@gmail.com if you have any questions, feedback, or advice you'd like me to answer live on the show. But now, finally, with all of that said, on with the show. Welcome back to the Mental Health Check-In Podcast. My next guest is a podcast host, a playwright, a screenwriter, and an artist. Her name is Charlotte T. Martin. How are you doing today?
Pretty good. How are you doing?
Doing good. How's your mental health right now?
Oh my God, what a question. It's healthy. It is struggling against some things, and it's healthy. My best friend right now is I go to therapy and do DBT work instead of the usual CBT. So I'm really big into holding two things in my head at once. How about you? How's your mental health?
Doing good. Thankfully, this podcast helps a lot, I think. So, and like I've had some good luck, but also some working on some things that I think's really good. Though you keyed in on something that I think is really interesting, that you said your mental health is healthy, and I don't really hear people describe it like that, like as far as being in a good mental health state. It's got me thinking about just like if someone asks, are we healthy, we'll usually think about the physicality, but especially nowadays, like the mental health, being mentally healthy is just as important, if not more important. And I think that's a really interesting way to word it, I think.
Yeah. Well, I'm trying to thanks for noticing, first of all. And I'm trying to step out of seeing my mental health as being good or bad. It's kind of a false dichotomy, because I think you wouldn't talk about your broken leg as being good or bad. Your leg's broken. And if it's in a cast and it's healing, then it's not good, because it's broken. But it's doing what it needs to do. It's healing itself with some help. And I think that's what my mental health is experiencing right now. Like, I'm going through some pretty difficult stuff personally. Again, I'll spare you the details for now, but I'm healing it. It is healing. I don't really know who's in charge there, if it's my mental health or me, or if we're the same creature, with some help. I go to therapy. I'm a big proponent of therapy. So, yeah.
Well, I'm glad to hear therapy's helping. I hope all the personal stuff it just gets better with time, I hope.
Thanks. Me too.
And I think that's another good way to look at too, the word healing, I think, because I had another guest, Wendy McComb, come on a few episodes ago, and she said that mental health isn't necessarily something that gets better and it stays good. Like it fluctuates, over time. Like it may be at 10 one day, and then it might be at 5 another day, 1, then 7, 2. It fluctuates a little bit, but the key word there is healing. I think that, well, like she said, you don't sweep the floor one time and it's clean forever. Working
Right.
on yourself, working on yourself mentally is very much a cleaning process. You gotta keep sweeping and cleaning over and over again, and it's a part of the healing process. It's a process for a reason, I think.
Absolutely. I like the cleaning metaphor a lot because um, I think you and I are probably going through some similar things as far as like mental health and racial identity is concerned. Like I'm a mixed race person and I'm not black. I'm Asian and white. And like that has been a whole thing for me for a long time, but then especially as that comes up right now in the present day in America is kind of tricky because as far as the cleaning thing goes, and I wonder if you can talk about this with even more personal experience than I, it's like I have to unlearn so much about what I was taught about like my own identity and my cultural relationship to my mental health is totally taboo. Like in both on both sides of my family, you just don't talk about it. And one of my family members, I won't out them, but one of my family members recently called me to be like, "You're the only person in our big extended family who talks about this kind of thing. Can I talk to you about my own struggles with my mental health?" And I was like, "Oh my god, of course," because we need each other to stay healthy. And so there's like a lot of cultural unlearning to do, and a lot of American culture around mental health is really hush hush. And like luckily it's getting a little bit more of its time in the sun now, but even that is like swinging all the way into this other direction of like, now we're only going to talk about mental health. It's like, well, there are some things that you should still kind of, maybe not should, is not the right word, but one might keep close to the chest because you can't just like open up all of your wounds to the sun and hope that it's going to heal it that way. Some of it is just internal work. So, yeah, the cleaning thing is resonates with me because I just love that you can't sweep the floor once and then it's clean forever. Every day is a new thing that you have to unlearn, relearn, recontextualize, but in the end it accumulates into something that puts you in a healing place ultimately.
Absolutely. And I think that that unlearning process, a lot of that, I think, and I could just be off base, let me know if I'm wrong here, but just me speaking personally, I think a lot of that stems from like a childhood saying, like when we're children, when I was a child at least, rather than speaking generally, when I was a child,
Mhm.
I took in things like a sponge, basically, like wherever someone would tell me or wherever someone would tell me about myself or about the world, it was easy for me to accept it because I didn't know much about the world. I didn't know much about myself.
Yeah,
So it was very much easy for me to just take everything. What's the opposite of taking something with a grain of salt?
that's a great question. Taking things like, oh Jesus, everyone who's listening is screaming the phrase at us right now. I guess swallowing something whole it comes to mind.
I've never heard that phrase before, but let's go with it.
Okay,
I
let's.
swallow I swallowed everything that was given to me whole, basically.
Yeah.
And it was hard to swallow, but
Oh,
I took in and just took it for granted that it was the truth. And now I'm learning that, okay, there are not everything that I've learned is necessarily true. Sometimes I just have to dig within and learn things about myself, or where I just go into the world and learn things about the world. Like, again, when it comes to Americans and just seeing America through the lens as a person of color,
mhm.
there's a whole lot of learning that you have to do, especially in the wake of the current climate we're in. And it gets sort of difficult to unpack, but that unpacking process is very much again, with mental health, it's an ongoing, possibly never ending unpacking process. But you
Absolutely.
just gotta, oh, go ahead.
Oh no, go ahead. You got what?
Um, I was just gonna say that it takes time and effort and even some help to unpack that stuff. Like you mentioned earlier, therapy helps, confiding in a friend or family helps, which
Yeah.
actually reminds me of something else you said. You mentioned that like you have family members who look to you because mental health is something that isn't really widely talked about, and because you're so open with it,
Mhm.
they're willing to come to you for help. So I guess I want to ask, what do this is going to be like a big scope question, I guess, but
Awesome. Yes, my favorite kind, for real.
what do we as a society have to do to make mental health less of a stigma than it is today?
Yeah, great question. And one I have thought about a lot. So I was also, in addition to everything else, I was raised Catholic, um, like for better or for worse. And I think the hang up that I have now around mental health particularly, or what I observe is the hang up around it, is that mental health or like, oh God, what is the word I want to use here? Again, not bad mental health, but like when you are struggling with being a mentally healthy person, whether that's because you have a disorder or a disease or trauma or whatever it is, for some reason, I think this stigma is rooted in morality. Where like if you struggle with having a healthy like mental health situation, it's because there's something wrong with you or you have done something wrong or bad or not good. And that I think is the idea that we've got to like completely burn to the ground and start over from, because there is absolutely no moral charge to any kind of mental health struggle. And that ranges from the like, I mean, I say the innocuous anxiety, which as someone with anxiety, I know is not at all innocuous, but like from anxiety to psychopathy, like or sociopathy, those things aren't necessarily morally reprehensible. It's the behavior and the action that can be taken out with those things in mind, whether it's like murder or whatever. Those actions are probably not good. I think we can all agree. Um, but if we just treat people who have these disorders, diseases, traumas, whatever, uh, as though they are bad people or lesser people or sick people, um, that's where we get into trouble. Instead, and this again is a really Catholic or Christian idea, which I don't mean, but like I said, I was raised Catholic, so I can't. I'm like I'm in it for life, I guess, without even being a practicing Catholic anymore. I think that the way to address that problem is to approach people with compassion instead of condemnation, first of all. And like that's a tall order for a lot of people, especially people in power, um, to look at people with mental health problems as somebody who needs to be loved first and foremost, and not loved like in a Jesus-y way even, but just cared for. Like people need the resources, they need the infrastructure to feel safe, to feel cared for, provided for. I'm lucky that I have a health insurance that covers my therapy sessions. Not everybody does, and that I mean that's a whole thing about universal health care. But like, uh, yeah, there needs to be a big agreement that there's nothing wrong with anyone who is mentally struggling with their health, or with their mental health. Uh, yeah, that's a long-winded answer to your question.
I think that was a really good answer too. It's very much like you said, like too many people look at people with these mental health struggles as a sort of other. Either they're a bad person or a lesser than person. They put them in that other category. It's their own subsection away from people, but you have to look at these people with these struggles as you would your friends or your family, or just not even just looking at it in a more relatable sense. Look at it with just empathy. Like, even if this is just a stranger on the street, you should have enough empathy to show some compassion. And like you said, compassion is a tall order for a lot of people. And for those people, I'd recommend maybe widening your scope a little bit, or just looking into some, just doing some research and like understand. And I think that's where the compassion problem comes in. Like, there's too many, these struggles are things that a lot of people hear about, but because they don't understand it, there's either a fear there or confusion. And we as human beings, it's a basically in anything we encounter that we don't understand, it's something we often just don't like. It's just a basic human thing for some reason. But I think if we just look into it a little more and widen our scope, compassion starts. And as soon as that spreads throughout society, it'll be a lot easier and more open to answer difficult questions like this.
Hmm. Totally agree. And I think even a step before compassion for others, I think there is a big missing piece in our emotional education in America anyway, of self-compassion. And like, how can you speak to yourself with kindness? We live in a culture that's like hustle, 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 and produce more and make more and be more and whatever. That there isn't a lot of room in that structure for pausing and not just self-reflection, but like everyone's hurting a little bit, which is kind of a sad thing to say, but like everyone has a pain point somewhere. And if I'm speaking generally, like if one could just isolate that pain point, whatever it is, whether it's guilt or shame or again, trauma, embarrassment, like low key embarrassment, and just be nice to yourself about that thing, whatever it is. It does two things. One, it makes you a little bit more calm down inside, and it knocks you off your own pedestal, which is kind of a big deal. Another very tall order, I think, in our culture is. Am I allowed to swear on this podcast?
Go right ahead.
Okay. Everyone should get interested in getting over their own bullshit, basically. And like, I'm not perfect. Nobody's perfect. And so if you can admit to yourself what your pain points or flaws, or not even flaws is too judgmental, but like places where you could grow or learn, then when you meet other people who have places where they can grow, learn, whatever, forgive themselves, it's way easier to reach out to someone who's on their level instead of like, well, I have all the answers and my mental health is in pristine condition. So let me tell you how to fix you. But that again, if compassion is a tall order, oh my God, self-compassion is like up with the satellites. Like it's out of sight.
Absolutely. And I think piggybacking off that, it goes back to what we were talking about with spreading compassion. Like, I think to be easier on ourselves, we have to be easier to other people. Because I feel like in a lot of cases, we're reflections of the people around us. And if we see the people around us being negative, be it strangers, friends, family, if we see those people being not so kind to other people, it's easier, or even us personally being not so kind to other people, it's just as easy to be not so kind to ourselves. So you gotta take the space to forgive yourself, and well, not even so much forgive yourself, just be kind to yourself, basically.
Absolutely.
Even just with a basic mistake, it doesn't mean you're a bad person or a wrong person. You just made a mistake, so don't be so hard on yourself. Or if you're just having struggles, it doesn't mean that you're necessarily broken. It just means you're in a struggle right now. And the sooner it comes to being kind to yourself, the sooner it is to working on those struggles and working on yourself mentally. So I guess my next question is, how do you be kind to yourself, I suppose?
I personally,
Personally, generally, how you would like to answer the question?
sure. Um, well, I can only really talk about my own life experience, I guess. So for me personally, as you mentioned, I'm a playwright and a screenwriter. And so I started doing this thing on Instagram where I write little scripts for what you could say in uncomfortable or awkward situations. Or that's how the project started. It quickly shifted into how to talk to yourself in awkward or uncomfortable feelings that you're having. So it's very internal monologue based. which is great because I talk to myself all the time. So I'm never there's never a dearth of content for me to talk about. So my personal way around or through those moments where I need to be kind to myself and it's a little bit hard is I literally write a script out for myself. And a lot of them I will then share on that Instagram account. And some of them I don't. I just keep to myself, or I'll write somewhere in my journal. That's another thing I do. In my journal, sometimes I will lapse into writing to quote unquote you. I'll talk to myself as a separate entity because I find that it's easier to talk to myself when I actually imagine that there is a version of me that is not having the emotional reaction to something that I am and who can speak calmly and like not always fully rationally, but just like wisely to me, which is like a little bit nutty, but it works. It's nice to have when you're feeling adrift in your own, or when I'm feeling adrift in my own thought spirals. It's nice to be able to reach out to somebody, even if it's just an imaginary version of myself, to sort of steady my own thoughts. So yeah, I mean, writing generally, but really specifically writing to myself and writing for myself is a great way I find to externalize some of those feelings that I need and maybe I don't want to get from someone else or wouldn't listen to from someone else. I guess what I'm saying is I'm the smartest person I know. No, that's not what I'm saying. But it is helpful to like keep an eye on myself, basically. And more generally speaking, how does one speak kindly to themselves? A great trick that I love is imagining your smallest, cutest version of yourself, like when you were a little kid. That whatever picture it is of yourself when you were really young, literal picture, and imagine that person in the room with you when you start or like sitting next to you and you start berating yourself for something or like bullying yourself. Imagine that little kid, and like you would never speak to a little kid like that, and especially not yourself as a little kid. So if one can imagine that little version of themselves when they start to feel down on themselves, then like that immediately will make you start speaking a lot kinder. And sometimes people use the example of imagine, would you ever say this to your best friend? And like some friendships, I have heard people speak to each other badly in friendships, but it's rare that you find someone speaking really, really aggressively toward a little kid. So that has been helpful to me as well.
Well, I'm glad that's been so helpful for you. And I'm really glad you mentioned these screenplay blurbs that you post on Instagram as well. That's a big reason why I wanted you on the podcast, because I think these blurbs are so interesting. It kind of reminds me, I'm not sure if you're familiar with them, but Bunny Michael, their higher self portraits.
Oh, yes. I love those. Yeah.
Yes.
Best.
And that's why I think when I think of these screenplay blurbs, they're like speaking to if not a higher self, then just a self basically. And it also randomly reminded me that I used to do something similar to that when I was in college a few years ago.
Uh-huh.
And it helped me go through some difficult situation. I may need to start that up again myself, but
highly. Yeah, those higher self, Bunny Michael is their name, right? Bunny. Yeah, they're funny, but it's not just that they're funny, is they're true. Like when who hasn't seen one of those posts and been like, oh yeah, I completely had that destructive thought. And to be given an alternative is so useful. I think I've made a big shift in my writing in the last couple of years or so. Instead of just like writing for myself, like they always advise that you do, like write what you love. Well, I discovered that what I love is to feel good about myself, which is sort of hard to do in the writing world a lot of the time. It's so much self-critique. And so what I wanted to start making was writing that was functional, but wasn't like a manual or something. that was like a tool for people. And so putting it in the screenplay format, it's definitely very distinct. I really like the way that screenplay format looks. And yeah, it's quick, and it can be very useful. In fact, some of those self-talk scripts come from actual like thought dialogues that I have in my head. And okay, I'll admit it. Some things that I have said out loud to myself before and was like, oh, that would make a really good script for other people to use. So yeah, I'm glad that you noticed them, and I'm totally flattered that it made you think of Bunny Michael's Instagram, because like that's the best. That's the best.
Yeah, it's really good stuff. And like for anyone listening, I definitely recommend like doing like a similar practice that because it makes you analyze certain situations with a not so much a critical eye, but let's say a forgiving eye. It
Yeah.
makes you look at yourself when you're viewing yourself in a dialogue, a conversation with yourself, and it's easier to empathize with yourself when
Mhm.
it's a person to person dialogue type of thing. And I kind of want to ask you, you kind of answer like what made you start doing this. So I kind of want to ask what made you kind of shift, because like you said, at first it started just like you were doing these blurbs on like a personal level, but
Mm.
then with the pandemic shifted and everything with social justice, it kind of shifted into these personal like commentaries where it would be like rather than you talking to yourself, you're creating I guess a character speaking to a person who needs to hear it, be it like for example a white person trying to deal with the racial climate right now. So I
Yep.
kind of want to know what made you shift your focus in that with your screenplays.
Great question. Bearing in mind that I wanted to be writing and creating pieces of writing that were tools and that were useful to people instead of just kind of like decoration. Um, I personally have been struggling a lot with, and I touched on it before, my own racial identity, and how it fits into our particular culture and society. And part of that has been distancing myself a little bit from the very white culture I have been raised in. Like my my really Anglo-Saxon name and just like my whole childhood and upbringing has been very white, culturally speaking. And I'm sort of actively trying to dismantle that for my own self. And while I was doing that, it's not in the past. I'm still very much in the process of that. Um, it occurred to me that I am absolutely not the only person going through this. And I can bet that I'm not the only person who is really uncomfortable in this situation. So a lot of it was self-talk and self-dialogue around my own personal experience. And then also, I was really interested in how the language around COVID and the language around particularly George Floyd's murder were converging. And this idea that like when we're wearing masks, some people are saying that they won't wear them because they can't breathe. And yet we have this man who literally could not breathe and was murdered in the street. So like, how can both of these things be true at the same time with the same words? Well, I mean, I still don't even have exactly the right way of expressing how powerful I think that is, and how it illustrates a really enormous divide of thought and priorities in this country. And so I started to pay more and more attention to what people were saying online, the language people were using, the arguments people were making, and it's like COVID and it's social justice all at the same time. Um, oh my God! And then throw an election on top. This is really
Mm.
quite a year.
Mhm.
um, but that feeling of wow, this is quite a year is like I think it would be very easy to throw your arms up and be like, all right, I'm just writing this one off. But I'm nowadays when I'm writing these scripts, I'm trying to synthesize all of these things that are happening into one tiny one by one square of dialogue because I want it to be useful. I don't want to be one of these people on Instagram, and there are millions of them. I'm not thinking of anyone in particular who use that platform, I think, irresponsibly, of like either promulgating fake news. I hate to use that word, but like lies or conspiracy theories, or they're out for self-promotion in the middle of a year where we really need to be banding together here. So sometimes even still, I feel very icky about posting things on Instagram, like at all. And I get over this by thinking, okay, how can I speak to this moment? And I can't think for everybody. I can only think for me, but I am in the middle of all of these different feelings and I can't be the only one. So how can I help is my feeling. And I mean, like, I don't have lots of money. I don't have a lot of power or influence anywhere. So how can I help is in this one tiny corner of the internet. And there's a lot going on. There's a lot going on in the external world. And how can anybody's internal, emotional, mental health push forward a better world in the midst of chaos? I have no idea if I just answered your question. I just kind of monologued. So sorry if you want to ask that question again, I can start over.
No, I think you really did. You said a lot of profound things, and you asked a really good question right there. How can you basically use your mental health to basically help in the midst of chaos and a chaotic year? And I think your screenplay blurbs on Instagram is a great step in being the help. It seems like such a small gesture on the surface, but I think these screenplay blurbs help start conversations either with our peers or start conversations with ourselves internally. It gets me at least thinking internally. I think there's power in that. It's not necessarily a physical power like a Senate House type of thing, but there's very much a not hypothetical power. It's I don't want to say spiritual power.
Oh my God, that would be very cool. A spiritual power. I'm gonna put that on a business card.
You know what? Let's go with then. There's a spiritual
Yes.
power in putting your ideas onto paper, putting that on social media, and then thousands of people around the world just conversing about it and thinking about their own thoughts and actions from it. And I think that's a really cool thing you do. And with that in mind, I guess I should ask, like, for anyone themselves who feel helpless or just don't know how to help themselves, not help themselves, but help as themselves, help calm down all the chaos, basically. Can you say anything to people, give advice for how they can find their own niche to start such conversations or help into the world?
Absolutely, because I have had this exact same conversation with myself so many times. I continue to have it, honestly. So thank you, first of all, thank you for saying all of that. It's very not only validating, but it's encouraging because I do often feel like, what am I doing with this thing? But then every now and then someone will write to me and be like, this helped me have a conversation with my family, or this helped me like think about things for myself. And that's very, that's just, I mean, I don't really have exactly the right words to express the joy that gives me that it's actually helping. So my advice to, and I loved how you said this, how can you help as you are, or as you? I think we get a lot of stuff in the media, a lot of messaging in various media forms of like, just be you. You are special and you are great. And that is true. You are special and great as you are. And so you need to turn the volume up on whatever that is. And don't be afraid. I mean, I can't tell you what to do. You're probably going to feel afraid, but just I just heard this on My Favorite Murder, the podcast. It's very niche. It's not actually. Tons of people listen to it, but true crime comedy. It's great. Recommend. And one of the hosts was saying you don't need to be brave, full stop. You just need to be more brave than you are afraid. And so we're all really afraid right now of so many things. And one of them is fear of judgment of other people, whether that they're people close to us or people on the internet or whatever. And if that's how you're feeling out there in the world, then I would say you just have to be braver than you are afraid, and you can still carry that fear around with you. But you got to turn up the volume on whatever it is you have to offer. And if that's knitting socks, that's great. We need socks. So like knit like the wind. Just turn the volume up on the socks, and that's useful. And I can say from personal experience, you don't even know how or why it's going to be useful all the time. But trust that, especially in the year 2020, whether you believe in a higher power of any kind or not, there's got to be a reason that you are alive right now. And you might not know what it is. You may never know what it is. But your existence on Earth is a miracle, first of all. I just listened to a whole story or podcast or something about like the odds of any individual human being existing is like 1 in 6 quadrillion or something. So wow, think about that. And the great news is you don't have to do anything more. You don't have to do anything different. You don't have to do anything right to add to the helpful cause of the world. You just have to be you at the volume of 10. So knitting socks is one example. Writing tiny screenplays on Instagram is another example. Cooking a meal for someone. Do you know how healing it is to eat a great meal with people you love? Like there is no position on earth in the made up hierarchy we've made as humans for ourselves. There is no position that is expendable, So don't be beholden to your fear. Just be a little bit more brave than you are afraid. And that's the difference. It might be a thin sliver of difference, but it is a difference. And those accumulate. So we need you. Come join us.
Very well said. That might be the perfect way to end the podcast, but I'm going to ruin it because I've got more questions.
Yes, bring it on. Bring it on.
Because we've been talking so much about showing compassion and like connectivity with everyone and whatnot, I kind of want to talk about your podcast that you just started recently called We Never Met.
Uh-huh.
So like, what made you come up with the concept for that podcast, first of all?
Such a good question. I have had a lot of podcasts in my life, and all of them have eventually gone away. And so I love podcasts. I love the whole medium of it. And so I knew that I wanted to have a podcast baseline. I believe anyone who wants to start a podcast should start with, you really want to have one, because they're a lot of work. It is, as you know, it is not a walk in the park. And I was camping, and I'm sitting around the fire, which is like my very happiest place. And it just like struck me all of a sudden. This was recent. So this was in quarantine, that like, oh man, I really miss meeting other people. And also I'm pretty introverted, or like, if I'm not introverted, I'm shy, which you may never be able to guess, but it's true. I'm shy. And so like, and there isn't a way to meet people in real life anymore for the present moment because of all the social distancing restrictions, which we should all be honoring. So it occurred to me that over a lot of time, I have built not a huge, but a following of Instagram followers. And I was like, I don't know most of the people who follow me on Instagram. And that's a shame, because there are people behind those screen names, and I want to know who they are. And it's a little bit weird because just like the transition from internet to in real life is like shady. But there just seemed to me no better time to make friends from the internet than when that's the only option. And then secondarily, as an introverted, shy person, I wanted there to be a little bit of a blueprint out there for like first meetings, because I think we're all going to be absolutely champing at the bit to make new friends and just socialize when we're all released from our homes after this. And God forbid that one's fear of social interaction should keep you from connecting with people. It's scary every time. Every time I have to talk to somebody new who I've never met, it's really frightening. And then they say hello, and it's like, oh my gosh, you're not scary at all. This is great. I always end up having a great time. So thanks for asking about that. Yeah, I love my little show that could.
You're welcome. And I think you're doing like some really cool work with that show. It's a very cool concept, and it just again calls back to the whole humans need to be connective idea that we've been talking about for the last 40 or so minutes. Like it in this time especially, it seems like a lot of people are divided. So to see you basically open your heart out to strangers and say, "Hey, let's get to know each other on this podcast," I think that's a really cool thing. And with that in mind, I guess I should ask when the world does calm down a little bit, social distancing rules or calm down a little bit, COVID calms down a little bit. How do you get to a point where you can trust people enough to open your heart out to them and get to know people again?
Oh my God, what a question. I think same rules apply in real life as they do on the internet. There is a level of protectiveness I think people should have about their heart a little bit and their vulnerabilities. Um, Not for any reason except that they're yours and they're fragile and you should honor them. Like if you're a shy person, those things are the most shy part about you. You don't want to tell anybody about your deepest fears, desires, whatever they are. Um, that being said, everybody can talk about pretty much anything. And there are big themes to life that everyone experiences that are not the weather. Oh my God, my dad's a weatherman, so he's going to be really upset when I tell him that. Like, oh my God, if I have to have one more conversation about it's finally getting autumnal out there, or like this quarantine is boring. Like I know I'm also living in that. But I just recorded an episode of that show today, and I did not see this coming, and it was such a delight. This is the episode with Nora Alamy. I think I learned how to pronounce her name. Yeah, Alamy. We started talking about money, which is like, I never talk about money. I don't like talking about money. I could really do without money as a thing in the world. It stresses me out is why. And yet I spent 45 minutes talking to a previous stranger about money because all of us interact with money. I'm like, what are your feelings around that? And that everything is connected, I guess, is what I'm trying to say. And so when we meet new people out in the real world in the after times of this crazy time, I think we have to cherish each other's physical presence with each other and stop wasting time with conversations that don't mean anything. And lots of conversations mean a lot of things, even if it's about something that seems superficial. Like I just talked to somebody about Dave Matthews Band, but we weren't really talking about Dave Matthews Band. We were talking about high school, another thing that a lot of people experience, and like the awkwardness of growing up and your like embarrassing guilty pleasures. And like, that's the stuff of life, is that anything that makes you smile or makes you sweat, basically, those are the things that you should lead with from now on, because that's a conversation starter. The weather, oh my God, who cares? Risk something. Talk about money. I mean, if you're comfortable with talking about money. I wasn't, but I had a great time. I was in good hands with Nora, so that's good. Yeah, just get to it. It's fun to be alive. So feel all of the feelings that go with that.
Very well said. I love that phrase. Feel all the feelings. That's great stuff. Yes. And thank you for answering that.
Oh yeah.
Uh, before we storm out here, I guess I kind of want to ask, like, well, this is like a twofold question, I guess. First, like, how do you keep yourself happy? Like, not just in the scope of the weirdness, chaos that is 2020, but just in general, pre-pandemic, what makes you happy? And I guess, do you have any advice for listeners who are searching for their happiness when they're struggling in different ways right now?
Holy Lord. Okay. Wow. I feel like the Dalai Lama. I better answer this right.
No pressure at all.
My God. Okay. First of all, I realized recently that the thing that makes me the happiest on earth, just like tingly joy all over, is when I don't even have to be the one who starts it. When my mom laughs uncontrollably, like can't breathe, can't finish a sentence, that is the best thing in the world. It's just such a joy to watch. And like I had the absolute pleasure of watching her and her two of her sisters like almost pee their pants laughing about something maybe like a year or 2 years ago now. Oh my gosh, that brings me such joy. Um, but outside of that, because I don't live with my mom, so I don't see her laugh all the time. Um, Other things that bring me happiness are I love to cook. Um, and I think actually what I'm realizing about my love for cooking is that it is maybe the one thing in my life that is creative, but not something I'm trying to monetize in any way. That sounds so icky, but like I'm a creative person um, as a profession. So like I love it, but it's also kind of work. But cooking is just something I get to do and I get to make something that is all of the senses engaged and uh, yeah, it's just for me. And then even better than just for me is when it's for other people and I get to cook for other people. Um, what else do I love dogs. I will pet any dog I see. That brings me a lot of genuine happiness. Um, and what was the second part? Was anyone who's listening, do I have advice for how to find their happiness? Gosh, no, but I'll try. Um, First, I would start first with what is happiness to you? Is happiness calmness? Is it like joy? Is it um, gratitude? Is it fulfillment? Like happiness is kind of a catch-all, but what specifically do you what feeling do you love the most? A generative feeling or a positive feeling? Because like we all kind of like to feel a little emo sometimes, but I wouldn't hang out there. It's probably not good for you. So what positive feeling do you like the most? And what is the last thing you can remember that brought you that feeling? Um, Speaking of mental health, when I can feel that I'm getting really anxious um, or really depressed, I suffer from both. The thing I do immediately if I am in the vicinity is I go to Target. This is not an ad for Target. I just like to walk through Target. I don't know what it is about the place. It's like nicely organized, brightly lit. There's always some chirpy little song playing. Um, that I know that that is like a booster shot of something. I wouldn't call it happiness. I wouldn't call it joy, but I guess it makes me feel a little bit safe. So like what do you need to feel first of all stable and safe and taken care of? And bonus if you can feel fulfilled, grateful, joyful, calm, at peace, whatever you want. So I guess my advice is start with happiness and the nuances of what that means, and then go get it.
Nice. I like the sound of that. And thank you for answering that. To piggyback off that, I kind of just want to ask, like, before we get out of here, is there anything that you kind of want to manifest into the world, either for yourself, like an affirmation, perhaps, like either for yourself or for the world that you just want to speak into existence right now?
Oh my gosh. Yes. I'm so glad that you asked. Okay. You're the first person I'm telling this to. So, oh my God, buckle up. Um, I have been for many months now thinking about how I can like help and how I can give what I've got to other people. So I am going to start doing some consulting work. Bleh, what a gross word. For like presentation and communication. We live in a world now where we're all trapped on screens or in emails. So many emails. That again, with this theme of connectivity, human connection, I went to acting school. So like I know all the tricks and I want people to have them so that we feel like we're talking to human beings again and not just robots on a screen. So I am starting that small endeavor of being a communication like consultant, coach, whatever. And even though I don't really like those words, I'm hoping that I can bring the spirit of it to the world. Oh my God, I'm sweating profusely right now.
I'm really excited for you. Thank you for sharing that with me. I
Oh,
feel so like
making me say it.
I feel so flattered you would share that here, and I'm just really that's such a big leap. That's so cool, and I'm so excited for you. So, best of luck
Thanks.
with that. I
Thank
hope
you.
nothing for the best for you for there. And now that is a good time to end the podcast, I
Okay,
think.
yes.
So I thank you for coming on. But just one more thing. I
Yeah.
have this ongoing thing with all my episodes. I call it giving people their flowers, where I let my guests know why I appreciate them in case we never speak again. And I appreciate you first and foremost for just taking time out of your day, taking time out of your busy schedule to come on this podcast. I'm always going to appreciate that for all of my guests. But above all else, I really appreciate you for sharing these screenwriting blurbs on Instagram. I think I kind of talked about earlier, but like they kind of help me make sense of the world around me, not just the world around me, but just me internally. And I kind of discovered them like at a time when I was struggling with a lot of things internally and around me with everybody else struggling. And it just reading them kind of helps calm me down a little bit, helps me make sense of wherever chaos is going on in my life and just puts me at ease. And I think that's a really great thing you do because I'm sure that a whole lot of other people feel the same way I do as far as your screenwriting blurbs and how they make them feel at ease. And I thank you for sharing that with the world. And again, I thank you for coming on this podcast. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Oh gosh, I'm going to walk around with that all day. Thank you.